And welcome to today's webinar on how building more diverse and inclusive government organisations can improve service delivery. I'm Mia Hunt from Global Government Forum, the publishing, events and research business for civil and public servants around the world. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of what we hope to cover in today's session before introducing you to our panellists. There is growing acknowledgement that teams made up of people from diverse backgrounds and with different perspectives tend to be more innovative and responsive, and often turn out policies and services that better serve citizens. As a result, many governments have set targets to increase the diversity of their workforce, working to attract and retain people of various ethnicities, people who are neurodivergent, those who have disabilities, and those who are LGBTQ+, for example. In this webinar, we'll explore why this is so important, how to approach recruitment in a way that fosters the creation of diverse teams, how to develop policymaking structures that harness the insights of employees from different backgrounds, and how to set and measure progress against diversity and inclusion metrics. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion, I'm sure, and we have a brilliant panel today who will share their expertise. We're going to start with short presentations from each of our four panelists, who I'll introduce you to in a moment. And we'll then move on to questions from you, the audience. So please do ask questions that come to mind at any time during the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So on the panel, we have Pia N. Butler, Director and Chief Human Capital Officer at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, in the USA. Tia is responsible for the recruitment, development and retention of CMS's most valuable resources, its people, who work hard to improve the population's health and quality of life. She previously served as an executive at the US Office of Personnel Management and at the Department of Veterans Affairs. She began her career in public service with the Department of the Navy and has also worked as a human capital and management consultant. We are also joined by Uliswa Mkazi, Director General of South Africa's Ministry of Public Service and Administration. Uliswa joined the public service in 1996 and has worked in various ranks, including as head of the Department for Community Safety in the Gauteng Provincial Government, before starting her current role at the Department of Public Service and Administration in March 2020. She has worked in various roles throughout her career, covering policy development and analysis, strategic leadership, monitoring and evaluation, people management, stakeholder relations, and corporate governance, among others. She is an activist and a qualified coach, strategist, and communicator. We have with us today Catherine Easter, Chief People Officer of the UK's Pension Protection Fund. Catherine has worked in senior HR positions in both private and public sector organisations. Before joining the Pension Protection Fund, she was head of HR Regulated Industries at the engineering consultancy Kia. There, she received industry recognition for increasing the organisation's workforce from 800 to 2,500 over a 2-year period, and implemented an employee engagement strategy aimed at significantly reducing staff turnover, which resulted in the company securing a top 20 place in the Sunday Times Best Companies to Work For list. She holds non-executive roles at Isle Utilities and at the National Infrastructure Commission, an arm's-length body reporting to Treasury. And we also have Jane Wiseman, Innovations in Government Fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, Harvard Kennedy School, USA. Jane has over 30 years' experience helping improve government operations as an appointed official in government and as a financial advisor and consultant to government. Her current consulting, research and writing focus is on government innovation and data-driven decision-making. She is a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and at the National Academy of Public Administration. So we're going to get some opening comments now from each of our panelists, and I'll ask Tia to speak first. Tia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mia. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of such a critical conversation, how building more inclusive organizations can improve delivery. My thoughts today are shaped by my experiences as a woman of color in the field of human resources with several federal agencies over my 15 years as a career public servant. There's great work underway across the United States federal government, and I'm excited to share just a glimpse into some of it today. On February 16th of this year, President Biden signed the executive order on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. This order builds upon previous equity-related executive orders by extending and strengthening equity advancing requirements for agencies. And it positions agencies to deliver better outcomes for the American people. The focus, to transform the way the federal government serves the American people. Recent transformative achievements have advanced the work of building a more equitable nation, the executive order states. Yet, members of underserved communities, many of whom have endured generations of discrimination and disinvestment, still confront significant barriers to realizing the full promise of our great nation. And the federal government has a responsibility to remove these barriers. Removing these barriers will create more diverse and inclusive organizations and in turn improve the delivery of our services to the American people. I have three primary themes today. One, connecting the mission or the bottom line to why it's important to build diverse teams. Two, assessing the potential barriers with a focus on culture. And three, developing a strategy for attracting and retaining the diverse talent. So, the why. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, is a federal agency in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. CMS serves the public as a trusted partner and steward dedicated to advancing health equity, expanding health coverage, and improving health outcomes. CMS administers the two largest federal healthcare programs, Medicare and Medicaid, as well as provides oversight for the Children's Health Insurance Program and the federal marketplaces. This year, over 160 million Americans will rely on the programs that CMS administers or oversees. That's what we deliver. Now, we all have natural biases based on our individual lived experiences. No one would expect this all-female panel to be able to speak from a personal lens, a challenge unique only to men. However, this is the exact problem we compound with minimal diversity in our workforces as a whole, and the lack of diversity at all levels of the organization, especially at the top. Gartner defines diversity as a collective mixture of differences and similarities. For example, individual and organizational characteristics, values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. So let's think about that definition in terms of CMS. How does our staff of 6,400 federal employees go about understanding the needs of the 160 million Americans we serve? And how do we validate that the policies we're developing or quality standards we're creating are meeting their needs? When there's diversity and inclusion amongst those policymakers at the table, and someone can speak to a personal experience or close encounter that differs from others, it creates a pause in the discussion to consider something more. And in that pause, the solution could provide greater access to those in rural communities, more preventive care options for those in underserved communities, or more affordable prescriptions for those who rely on them, all improving delivery. This is the why. Inclusion leads to greater innovation, and continuously identifying ways to improve our delivery matters. So once your organization understands why, you can begin to look at how you actually do it. I suggest you begin by assessing. Look at your demographic data, race, gender, ethnicity, at all levels. What is it telling you? Representation is valuable to track, irrespective of whether an organization is working toward a specific target, because it helps in understanding the current state and identifying opportunities for improvement. Look at your culture. What are your demonstrated values and behaviors? While most organizations have a set of values, these values are much easier to create and promote than to actually live by. Ask, have you created an inclusive environment where that workforce can thrive? Focus on some of the drivers of inclusion: fair treatment, integrating differences, psychological safety. Then think about how you can effectively measure and evaluate the degree to which diverse individuals can fully contribute in your organization or feel included. That's the thriving. It's also important that you then think about creating metrics that you can use to address, track, monitor, and report on. Why? Because what gets measured gets done. This level of accountability is important, and I'm not exactly sure that we're doing enough of this just yet in government. Studies have shown that where there are challenges with organizational diversity, there is most likely also a problem with equity and inclusion. Inclusion has quickly become a key differentiator between a positive working culture and a negative one. Again, all factors that can impact the bottom line, the delivery of our services, and achieving the mission. As you look back at your data, and specifically your culture, use it to inform the development of your strategy. It should guide whether you need to focus on building diverse candidate pools, ensuring equity in the selection process to create a more diverse workforce, or if you need to focus on retaining the diverse talent you already have. Or maybe your strategy needs to consist of all three. At CMS, we established an objective of mitigating bias and enhancing equity in our talent processes. Our data showed that we had diverse applicant pool or candidate pools, but less diversity in our selections, or who was actually offered the job. Earlier this year, we actually rolled out a hiring panel initiative to address just this. Now, essential to any strategy is educating and providing the tools, and you need to be prepared for potential pushback. Don't assume that all employees will buy into a DEI initiative. It takes courage to drive cultural change, and some are not interested in it because maintaining the status quo is easier, and in some cases, it is actually beneficial to them. Do be sure, however, to communicate often to create transparency about why the specific initiative is underway and what specific goals or outcomes are the focus as a result. For CMS, Diverse and Thrive is grounded in our applicant and employee experience. Focusing more broadly on the experience, you can integrate data from the entire employee lifecycle to include data on engagement and its drivers. This approach puts a greater emphasis on the perspectives and experiences of the employees, which allows you to know if you've created that environment for thriving yet. The more organizations choose to intentionally use insights to identify and improve experiences across the talent lifecycle, the greater the opportunity for your organization to readily adapt and shift when necessary, and to improve those experiences that also support employee retention. I'd like to end with a statement from the Executive Order 13985. By advancing equity or inclusion across the federal government, we can create opportunities for the improvement of communities that have been historically underserved, which benefits everyone. For example, an analysis shows that closing racial gaps in wages, housing credit, lending opportunities, and access to higher education would amount to an additional $5 trillion in gross domestic product in the American economy over the next 5 years. That's just one reason how building more inclusive organizations can improve delivery.
Thank you very much there, Tia. I think that was a really brilliant opener, kind of set out really clearly why this is so important, what diversity and inclusion means to service delivery, some of the findings in the CMS, and Barney's executive order sort of driving this in the background. So thanks very much for this, for that. Yelizabeth, we're going to come on to you next, please. Yelizabeth, are you there?
Apologies, I'm busy speaking and I'm muted. Good afternoon. It's afternoon from South Africa. I know somewhere in the world it's in the morning. And I just want to firstly just to highlight that I'm also doing this presentation also informed by my own experiences of being a woman who has grown up in an apartheid South Africa and a democratic South Africa. And I have over 25 years of experience as a career public servant, started from the lower levels in the public service, and I'm currently at the top level of being a Director General for the Department of Public Service and Administration. Our main role is around developing norms and standards for the public service so that there is efficiency and effective handling of matters in the public service. That's broadly our own mandate. I do also want to highlight that as a woman who has been young in a democratic South Africa, who has grown up in a democratic South Africa, I have had opportunities that I would have never had in the past. And I think that it's a testament of the fact that currently I occupy the role that I occupy. It's because of the focus of our government, democratic government, on diversity and inclusion of people who were historically excluded from decision-making in the country. That would include Black women, that would include Black people in general, including Black women, that would also include young people, as an example. That would also include people with disabilities in the country. And so I have decided to use this Khoisan language, which is in our constitution as a country, but also in our coat of arms, Ike Charake, which basically talks to unity in diversity, basically showing our efforts as a country to harness unity between our thoughts and actions and ensuring that there is diversity. Next, please. Just a little bit about our South African public service. This is basically employees in national and provincial government departments. We have about almost 1.2 million of them, and the females are at 65%. The total number of females in government are at 65%. However, if you go into management level, you would see that the total number of females is at, I think 40%, 44% of females in management level, which is your, what we call senior management service, which is your decision-making levels in the public service. There is some data I've shared about the number of the older people within the public service, 55 and above, and I'm not going to focus on that for the purpose of this presentation. I do want to highlight that our employees with disability currently stands at 0.93%. This is something we're not proud of, because we have a target of 2% of integrating 2% employees with disabilities in the public service. However, many departments have been struggling to reach this target, and there's a number of reasons that we've been given around this, and we continue to work with organizations of people with disabilities and find a mechanism to bring more people with disabilities in the public service. The exclusionary practices I've highlighted earlier on of apartheid still permits in society one way or another, and currently compounded as well by economic, geopolitical, and growing social and environmental pressures. For instance, whilst we have many people who are connected in South Africa in terms of ICTs, we also have many people who are in rural areas, who are in areas that are not accessible and that are connected, that are not connected. So from a recruitment point of view, you cannot, it would not be easy for you to go fully on an ICT-based platforms for recruiting people, because how about those young people and older people who still qualify to apply for jobs who are in these particular communities? Next, please. Some of the interventions that we have done post-democracy in respect to this area of work is diversity for us is enshrined in our constitution. So we have 12 official languages as a country, and we have a public service that is governed by democratic values and principles of human rights, equality, freedom, fairness, and etc. We also have our own legislation that governs us, my department and the public service broadly, which is called the Public Service Act 1994, and we have an employment equity. And this places diversity in the workplace from a gender, race, age, religion, sexual orientation point of view as well. Any discriminatory act is viewed as a serious, in a serious light, and every employer must take steps to promote equal opportunity in the workplace by eliminating discrimination in any employment policy or practice. Next, please. So for us, when we talk about recruiting for diversity to thrive, I've already highlighted by law that we have employment equity plans, and therefore we have our targets very clear in respect to the employment equity plan. So from a recruitment point of view, we are able to say that in this department, we have less women in management, and therefore our efforts in recruitment in management must focus on bringing in women in the decision-making role. And we even go further to say, out of the women that we have in management, we have most of them who are coming from the Black population, and therefore we have to put a mechanism to bring in white women or women of Indian origin and etc. into the public service as well in terms of decision making. So we can narrow our targeted candidates from a recruitment point of view, including from a headhunting point of view. But what is important is that we must ensure that we put that upfront in our application processes. When we invite people to apply, we must put that information upfront that a woman is preferable for this particular position because of the equity targets. We have seen also that advertising in social media and in digital media broadly also helps us to reach a diverse pool of people to apply for jobs in the public service, in particular young people who are found in this particular sector, I mean, in the social media mainly. And also we look at removing financial and non-financial barriers for entry. One of the things we have done is to remove the barrier of entry of experience for young people to enter, for qualified young people to enter the public service. So that we can have more young people in the pipeline that are entering the public service and that are developing into different roles in the public service. I think that I've covered a lot of issues I want to say, except the last issue, that just to say that we have a number of programs that we work around to create awareness and promote diversity within our public service. And obviously ethics and values are part of our and discipline is part of the issues from an organizational culture that those are some of the tools we utilize to support diversity. If you can move to the next slide, please. And I wanted to highlight some of the challenges and some of the responses. Of course, when we look at our statistics, we are concerned that we are having an aging public service in South Africa, and we need to start to put interventions in place, which is why you'll hear me a lot talking about bringing in young people into the public service. And we are also confronted with a slow economic growth and a rising wage bill, which may affect a recruitment of young people in large numbers, and therefore keeping the current profile of public servants. It's a risk that we're facing, and we're looking at how we introduce mechanisms to really incentivize bringing more young people in the public service. We also have, it's not a challenge per se to have active labor unions in the public service. We welcome that. However, we have a challenge of managers who at some stage are not very comfortable to lead, and therefore end up co-managing with labor. And that's an issue that we're attending to in terms of also our capacity building for our managers at different levels. Some of the plans, we are having an HR strategy, and we are looking at developing a pipeline through the talent management interventions. We're also quite going big on coaching and mentoring of public servants. As a country, we have a program that we're implementing now. We've taken a number of public servants below 35 and we put them on a leadership development program supported by coaching and mentoring, so that they could be able to rise into various roles and responsibilities confident from a leadership perspective. We're doing some work around our own regulations and cutting bureaucracy and cutting red tape where possible, and also empowering our heads of departments in the public service with more powers from a legislative point of view in terms of their roles and responsibilities. The last part for me would really, in the next slide, would really be to just say thank you very much for this opportunity as South Africa to be able to feature in this conversation, and we look forward to hear more ideas on how we can do better in this particular area of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Plenty of food for thought there, sort of sharing your experience, outlining the South African public service in terms of diversity and inclusion and the legislation governing it. Touching on the ageing workforce, which I think is becoming a problem for many civil and public services around the world, and how to attract young people in, and recruitment approaches as well, as the challenges and barriers and how we overcome them. So yes, thanks again very much for that. Catherine, over to you now, please.
Thanks, Mia. I've purposely kept the presentation relatively short and simple, even though, as we've heard already, it's a complex and nuanced issue. I'll have the next slide to talk about the sort of organisation I work in. So we are a public corporation. I don't know how much people know about the way that different organisations are set up in the UK government, but the one that most people have heard of is the BBC. And so we are a similarly constituted organisation in that we have an independent board, but we are accountable to government. And what we do is when employers go insolvent, we take over the assets of the pension schemes that they sponsored, and we pay compensation to the members of those pension schemes. And I guess what that means is that the public service we provide is slightly different to some of the other ones you've heard about, because we have quite a narrow group of service users. And quite often when people talk about diversity inclusion, they talk about reflecting the communities that they serve. We actually have, because of traditionally in the UK, defined benefit pension schemes were the province of big manufacturing type organisations, that quite a lot of our members, not completely, but a big proportion are people based in the north of England, quite often male, quite often white. But I think the thing that we've really focused on is how some of the things that other people have already said, how having diversity brings innovation of thought, but also risk management in terms of being able to identify when things go wrong, having the psychological safety to put your hand up and say, I'm worried about this, which I think whatever public service you're in is an important aspect. So we now manage over £39 billion worth of assets. And of course, with that comes a big responsibility and a great deal of risk management. Our employees are based in South London and in an area called Croydon, which is a very ethnically diverse borough and is also relatively low social mobility, I would say. So we think a lot when we think about diversity in the organisation, we think probably more about the area that we're part of than we do reflecting the communities that we serve, although that there is a part of that too. The next slide is a little video that we put together to try and explain, I suppose, why the organisation believes diversity and inclusion is key to all employees thriving. I think somebody asked a question about, how do you convince the naysayers or the people that might be scared that if the status quo changes, they lose some of their position. And I guess the message we tried to get across was that everybody benefits from inclusion because of that idea of speaking up with ideas, speaking up when things are going wrong. That's not to say, I think one of the challenges you then have is that's not to say we shouldn't appreciate and respect the challenges that people in underrepresented groups continue to face in reaching senior level positions. But it was the sort of opening, if you like, of our diversity and inclusion strategy was to say there is something for everyone here. So it's important, particularly that inclusion element. So just show you the little video because I think it brings it all together quickly. Thank you. Probably pop to the next one. So basically, that was our intro to the D&I strategy that we launched, looking at giving a focus on 3 key areas to start with that are underrepresented in our sector. That they were women, people from ethnic minorities, and those with a disability. And how we've looked to build diverse teams are, we had an independent review of our processes on recruitment, having a look at whether there is any indirect bias introduced by our process. I think there's another bullet point now. We noticed that a lot of the challenge when we looked to recruit people from diverse backgrounds was that a lot of the professions that we traditionally have people in are largely with people from overrepresented groups, if you like, and therefore we've created a number of apprenticeships that brought people into professions that have been traditionally underrepresented. So things like pensions administration, investment management, quite specific areas of technology. I mentioned earlier that we think it's really important to be part of the community that our organisation is domiciled in, and so we've done a lot of work with the community to raise the profile of the organisation so that we can be recruiting in to those underrepresented groups. The thing that we've done mostly as a result of signing a Women in Finance Charter that was created by the UK government, and a race action thing that was also introduced, not by government, but a non-profit organisation. Both of those organisations talked about incentivising senior managers to build diverse teams, and what we had to do as part of that is to explain to people, what do diverse teams look like, and also challenge people's thinking on what they thought people needed to have to be able to do the job. Quite often, people have transferable skills, and actually they're the things that are most difficult to recruit for. The traditional experience or the years and years as a pensions lawyer might not necessarily be the thing that's really needed in a role. Then on to the next, I think, was my high level on how have we allowed employees to thrive. So a big part of this, I think, is asking employees how they're experiencing the organisation. So we know that we can do all we can from the centre in HR and communications to tell people these are the commitments we've got, to tell people these are the values they've got. But if that's not how people are experiencing their line manager and their colleagues, then what we say corporately isn't going to matter. Therefore, we do various check-ins with people, asking them how they're experiencing the organisation. We have a number of network groups that we support, both in terms of with administration, setting up the groups, giving them some budget. But I think the thing that was really important to me was to make sure that there was no sense that I was passing the problem to people in underrepresented groups to fix themselves. One of the things we did was some reverse mentoring, where we asked more junior people from underrepresented communities to mentor members of our executive. And I remember being really struck by somebody saying, I feel that my performance, I have all the Black people in my community on my shoulders, I have to be better than everybody else, because if I do anything wrong, that might hold back a member of my community in the future. And so I think it's really important to look to work in collaboration with people who have the lived experience, but not to add to that lived experience by saying, okay, you know what it's like, so come help me fix the problem. As part of that, we've incentivized people to take part in the network groups and share their stories of what's worked for them in the organization and what's been difficult, so that we can bring to life for people where this is an issue and what people need us to do to make it work for them. And that is my...
Thank you very much, Catherine. So yeah, touching there on innovation of thought, on the importance of risk management, the video there kind of bringing it to life and communicating to staff what you're trying to achieve and what the benefits are. The action that PPF has taken to build diverse teams and getting sort of employee feedback as well. So yes, great. Thank you very much for that there. Jane, we will come to you now, please, for your comments.
Am I on?
Hi, Jane, can you hear us okay? Are you okay to give your comments now?
Sure. Well, I first want to say thank you for including me with this very amazing group of international thinkers on this topic. My perspective comes from really two places. One is that I think a lot about government from the perspective of chief data officers in cities, mayors, chiefs of staff, because I help run networks at Harvard that bring those folks to campus twice a year. So that's one hat that I'm wearing in this conversation. The other hat that I'm wearing is I've done some research in recruitment in law enforcement, and specifically looking at how to improve the diversity of recruitment in law enforcement. So those are kind of the two hats I'm wearing right now. And if I were to sort of try to give you three words, they would be innovation, welcome, and fairness. So why do I pick the word innovation? To me, innovation comes from a diversity of ideas and perspectives, right? There's been a lot written about how companies like Apple that are really innovative structure their physical organization in such a way that you can't get to the restroom without bumping into people from other departments, because diversity of perspectives is what fuels innovation, right? Okay, so generally when we think about diversity, we think about gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, ability status, LGBTQ, but I'm throwing a new one in, which is generation. I run a leadership program for state government leaders, and it's a 6-month program. In the beginning, they couldn't stop talking about the generational, and certainly in the US, we now have more generations because we have people who, looked at what happened in the stock market or, things going on in the world, and have to work longer than they had ever planned on it. So we have people in their 70s in the workforce. At the same time, we have people in their 20s And this is kind of the first time that managers have had to deal with that. So, you know, yes, there's a very different way that women and men approach things, you know, people from different perspectives, but also just the idea of being from a different generation. And I'll give you 2 examples of how kind of a perspective that wasn't always in the room adds value. So I went undergraduate to Smith College, and our first female college president, Jill Kerr Conway, was, you know, she was on the board of directors at Nike. She was the first woman to be on the board of directors at that company, and in a time when there weren't a lot of women in the boardroom. So this is, you know, probably 20, 30 years ago. She was looking at what they were doing in sports apparel, you know, running shorts, t-shirts. And she said, but women who run might want to have a supportive bra to run in. Now, she's in a room full of men. Maybe one of the men was going to think about sports bras, but I am so grateful to her insight, because I now purchase this product, which is only on the market because a voice that wasn't always in the room was there. So a good friend of mine who, you know, was a Black man at the DEA and then at the DOJ, you know, in the 70s when it was much more challenging than it is today. He always says to me, who are we not remembering? Who do we need to include? So, so story number 1 is about the sports bra. Story number 2 is about the Barbie doll, which was invented a long, long time ago. But Mattel was the toy company that was, you know, in the 1950s, just all white men. But a wife of one of the executives watches her daughter playing with what were then paper cutout dolls, and they were all little girl dolls. And the mother kept noticing that the little girl shaped paper dolls were all playing as nurses and teachers and mommies. They weren't playing as little girls. And so the woman says to her husband, you know, you really need to create a grown-up woman doll. And the husband says, we know what we're doing here at this company. Don't worry about it. So later the family's on vacation in Europe, and they're in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. And she sees in a shop window a grown-up woman doll. And so she shows her husband, now, see, it's possible. It can be done. You should do this. So as it turns out, because she spoke no German, she did not know that that was a special doll that is only sold to adult men, and it is only available in certain kinds of stores. It wasn't a mass-produced thing, but because of her outsider perspective, she had this like, okay, there it is, you know. So, so the sports bra and the Barbie doll are both examples of how the perspective of someone who's not in the room can be really valuable, you know, who isn't traditionally in the room can be really valuable. So, so yes, we all know that it's important to have diversity in who we hire. It's really important that as we're recruiting, we make people feel welcome. So when I looked at the research on police recruiting, there was a professor who's amazingly patient. She watched 206 police recruiting videos, and she and her grad students categorized all of them. 15% of these videos showed not a single woman. So you imagine you're a woman, you want to be a police officer, and the advertising video doesn't show a single woman. And of those videos that showed a woman, they talked for only half as long as the men on the video. 8% of the videos showed not a single officer of color. So we want people to feel welcomed. So there's studies out there about the language you use in the job posting. You know, if you use words like competitive versus communication, it changes whether you get men or women applying for the job. Even the email inviting people, there's research out of the UK that Black applicants did far better when just the tone and language used in the email saying, would you apply? So there's a lot of research on this topic that I am calling welcoming, which is how do we make people feel as they're coming into the process, assigning a mentor to anyone, but particularly women and people of color, I think is helpful in bringing them through the process. And there've been a bunch of studies that show, when you target and send specific messages to specific people, it can make them feel more welcomed. So there's a state police agency in the US that uses digital advertising. They did geofencing around the graduation ceremony at a historically Black college and targeted people who they knew were graduating from historically Black college, or an influencer, your family and friends. So there are ways that you can make people feel more welcome in the process. And then, my third comment, so innovation, welcome, and then fairness, retention. How many of us are going to want to stay in a job where no one looks like us? Right. My first job out of college, I remember I got to go on a business trip because it was a, bus full of white men and me and a Black man. Right. We got the opportunity to go as these token members, and I stayed in the job, but I didn't feel welcome. But how do we make sure that fairness is not only present, but is well communicated, that people know there are rules against discrimination, biased behavior, retaliation? There are many government organizations where people do not feel heard. I love that video, by the way. It was so wonderful to see how all of the people in that video just felt like they could be their real selves at work. That's not true in every organization that I can speak for in the US. And certainly in law enforcement, there are a lot of places where speaking up is not encouraged because it's a hierarchical organization. So, so I guess I would say diversity matters in every possible way, and diversity of thought is what we get as an end result when we think about all the different people that we need to include. There's statistics around this tokenism research, and there are different thresholds. Some say it's 15%, some say it's 20%, but at any rate, if you're the only one, you certainly know you don't have peers that you can feel connected to. And certainly if we don't have guardrails around the behavior of the higher ups, or frankly, everyone in the organization, that we treat people with respect and dignity, and that when we don't, there are consequences, because we all know organizations where if there aren't consequences, everybody knows and the culture is toxic. So that sounds like a really down note to end on, but I do want to say that as I talk to leaders in government across the US, the last 3 years have been tough. And I think to bring in fresh ideas is more urgent now than at any time in my 35 years of being in and out of government and being a supporter of excellence in government. We were, I guess a couple of days ago, the official emergency ended for COVID-19, but I would say right now we're in, and I don't want to overuse the word, but I do think we're in a moment of crisis for the public sector. They are exhausted. These are people who have run a sprint, a marathon, another sprint, another marathon for 3+ years. And in many cases, the older workers who can retire, and this is very much true in law enforcement, anyone who's anywhere close to being able to retire financially is out of there. So people are understaffed, overworked, and underappreciated. At the beginning of the pandemic in the US, we had, people singing songs and, banging pots for the first responders, for the medical people, for the delivery people. We all, I don't know about you, but we put little notes up. Thank you for the deliveries. You're keeping us safe. No one thanked government workers. And in fact, I did a project with vital records offices. Think about it. Births and deaths kept happening during the pandemic, and those people had to show up to work, many of them in clerical positions that are low paid. And we're in the middle of a culture war in the US where there are people saying, I'm not going to wear a mask. You can't force me to wear a mask. And so the stress level of public servants at this moment in time is such that I feel passionately about participating in this conversation about how do we bring more diversity, more energy, more ideas into government. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. So sort of coming at it partly there from a law enforcement perspective, looking at generational differences, the importance of having someone in the room who can put forward a perspective or idea that wouldn't be represented otherwise. Research around recruitment, the need to kind of welcome people and have mentors in place, retention, and the impact of burnout and getting in fresh ideas as well. So thank you very much for to all of you for your opening comments. We're going to go now to the Q&A session. So we have got some questions coming in already from the audience, which is brilliant. Do keep those coming. If you do want to ask one, then again, just type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Okay, so I saw one come in. This is directed, first of all, at you, Tia. This is from Jane, and she asks, she said she's really keen to hear how you can change status quo when there is resistance. And what has been effective in cultivating equality?
Wow. So I would maybe first start by saying acknowledging the resistance is key. You know, I always say you can't really solve a problem if you're not really sure what the problem is you're seeking to solve. So really understanding that it is resistance, that's the first step, if you will. Then I would add that it's important to try to be curious about understanding what is the root cause of that resistance. Is it really, you know, what was communicated in my organization was, well, that's gonna extend the hiring process. It's gonna take us longer to make selections if we've got to involve more people in the hiring process. Okay. That may indeed be true. However, if you are hiring someone that then doesn't stay in the organization and you're having to do it all over again, your total time, if you will, is better spent invested on the front end and ensuring that you are indeed selecting individuals that do meet the greater need of the organization. Like I said, having that appropriate representation, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, because that really does impact how we deliver our services on the back end, if you will. The other piece that I think is critically important is really just making certain that you are, in communicating your why, also establishing ways to hold folks accountable. If it is indeed important to the organization and to leadership, it is something that should be embedded into your systems, into your structures, your processes. Eventually, it will be built into your culture, but what is being communicated is this is something that's important to us. We expect leaders, managers to engage in this way. And when you do not do so, you're holding them accountable for such. So I think earlier, one of my colleagues referred to it as the consequences. So how are you creating consequences for those who are not actively engaged in what the organization has determined is not only the right thing to do, but has a business driving reason for actually doing it as well.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that question about how you change the status quo when there is resistance?
Well, I think that we all will acknowledge that changing status quo in government is really hard and takes a long time. And the importance of executive leadership, leadership from the top, cannot be understated. I spent a lot of time in the world of data. And New York City had the same mayor for 12 years in a row, Michael Bloomberg, who was all about data. And it took 12 years of his administration before people, they really changed the culture that everyone just knows you have to use data to make decisions. But status quo change does not happen overnight. You know, we have to somewhere find it in ourselves to be patient and brave. Because what is that saying? Polite women never, well-behaved women seldom make history, something like that. You know, I mean, people are like, when I was in government, I always said, unless someone's mad at me, I'm not doing my job.
Catherine, you took yourself off mute, so I didn't know whether you wanted
Yeah,
to.
I realised I did a little reply in the Q&A, but I think there's two things that I echo here, and Jane has said executive sponsorship, not only in words but in action. So we've used incentives to do that. But also I think the acknowledging the resistance, and Jane briefly acknowledged the sort of culture war aspect, and I think that is what's making it a more difficult backdrop, actually, because I think initially when we talk a lot about doing the right thing, and it felt very clear and not a big argument that treating people fairly and giving people equal opportunities, you know, was doing the right thing. I think the thing that has now become challenging is the conversations become more sophisticated about things like privilege and helping people who think they got there because they're great, and if other people are great, they'll get there too, and having to pop their little bubble that perhaps they got there, you know, yes, they may be great, but other great people may have been overlooked because of some systemic or structural reasons. And I think that is the bit I'm finding most challenging in my role at the moment, is that I feel like people are starting to do that slight whataboutery. Oh yes, but what about the men, or what about these people who are going to get left behind because we're focusing so much on equality for other groups? And I started by trying to sort of explain it all logically, but I have started a little bit just to say, oh, well, you know, they've had their turn, and to slightly move that conversation on, because I've realized that actually sometimes trying to challenge some of that thinking about fairness or otherwise just doesn't get you anywhere. And actually it's much more about we're moving to a new way of being, and part of that new way of being is acknowledging some of the mistakes of the past.
Yusuf, do you want to answer that question about assistance?
So I feel that or my experience is telling me that patriarchs in my generation are very sophisticated, are getting more sophisticated. So I always say patriarchy in my generation is more sophisticated, maybe compared to how our mothers and our grandmothers were living. As a result, the boardroom becomes a real battleground, but there's no weapons that are displayed that you can point fingers to the weapons and etc. So we will continue talking about these things, but if we don't use specific legal and policy instruments that we have to ensure that there is implementation, and where there is failure to implement without justifiable reasons and plans to correct what is going wrong, we have to ensure that there is consequences at the highest level that is possible. From a leadership level, there has to be consequences in order for us to change the status quo when it comes to women in decision making, when it comes bringing young people into the system itself of governance and decision making. I think for me, that's very important. Resistance is there, and we can't be negotiating with people, with colleagues, with public servants who are bound by the same principles of the Constitution that we're also bound by. Yes, we need to have champions to champion this work, but beyond that, we need to empower the champions. I, as a Director General or as a head of the department, I must be empowered as a champion with the tools that make it possible to deliver on this work. And that those tools are there in the system, but we must utilize them. And I'm saying there's legal tools I've shared with you, at least in respect to South Africa. There's policy tools that we've put in place. There's other things that we do, like we look at performance contracts of heads of departments and ensure that there is implemented, these diversity issues are integrated. I can tell you, for instance, the 50% target for women in leadership in the public service in my department were also one of the departments that are struggling to meet the 50%. I've had to go deeper and understand our panels when we do recruitment, and I've had to go back to introduce an affirmative action policy to ensure that I don't just rely on people who are in the panel, but I have a tool in place that assists me to ensure that when there are women who have performed better, even if they're not number one in terms of the list of recommendations, if the difference between the two is so small that I'm empowered to be able to appoint the woman. Because if I don't have an affirmative action policy, I would not be able to do that. So for me, those tools are very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on to another question, but it sort of ties in to something that you've all touched on, I think, at one stage or another, and that's the importance of gathering and analysing data and setting metrics, targets, reporting on those. And Tia, I think you mentioned that you don't think government organisations do enough of that. Is that something that the rest of you agree with, and what needs to happen to ensure that it is done in the right way, effectively, is kind of transparent and accountable, and does make progress? Jane.
So I'll take that one, because one of my great hopes for the future is that we will have greater data literacy among our leaders. So in the private sector, there's an annual survey of kind of C-suite people, and it's a sort of data and technology lens. But in their survey, 99% of companies are investing in data analytics, and only 27% have seen data culture change. So, you know, what are the reasons for this? Well, think about who are the CEOs. They're typically pretty far removed from, if you see the people who are creating ChatGPT, they're a different generation. And so there is, I think, a great concern, both in, you know, in terms of capacity to crunch the numbers, and then the leadership capacity to understand what they mean. And you know, I teach a leadership course on how to understand data, and I have a whole data bias course because you know, I don't know if anyone saw in the news recently, there was a woman who drove her car into a lake because she was following GPS. We have this thing called automation bias, right? Like, we think the computer must be right. No, we so need critical thinking data skills. And that's a big gap in the US. But I am hopeful because in the US, we have something called the Evidence Act, and it required chief data officers, chief evaluation officers, chief statisticians in all of the largest federal agencies. And they had to submit a, I forget what it's called, but it's essentially a learning agenda, which is essentially, what's your plan to teach people about data? And we're not quite there yet, but I'm hopeful because I do feel like ChatGPT was the first big data analytics thing that was dinner table conversation. And that's only because people were asking their teenage kids, you know, can that write your paper for you? But I hope that that will start us thinking more about, well, you know, like, we might think this is all this new AI. No, like, for years we've been watching the movies Netflix told us to buy because of AI. You know, 2/3 of revenue on Amazon is stuff I decided to buy, and the other third is revenue from things the algorithm told me to buy. So I am hopeful that we will be turning a corner soon on data literacy, but it is an urgent need in government.
Do others agree? Catherine?
It's been really interesting to me to hear such a broad range of perspectives, and I think one of the things the UK government has tried to do in this area is around pay gap reporting, and I think that definitely, to Tia's point of what gets measured gets managed, did wake people up to this idea, particularly back to those people who are thinking if you just work hard and, you know, do a good job, you'll be recognised. Did shone some light onto that. The challenge, I think, is with all of these issues, they aren't quick fix issues, and so the gaps have persisted, and they've sort of gone out of fashion in terms of talking about them. So at our organisation, we report not only on our gender pay gap, but also on our ethnicity pay gap. But actually, the way that the government decided to do the calculation isn't that intuitive. So people end up having slightly the wrong conversation, which is, are you paying men and women for the same job different amounts? And the answer to that is no. It's the much more sophisticated, interesting question about why do we value the jobs that women are more likely to go into, so customer service, HR, less highly than those that men traditionally go into, so investment, finance, that kind of thing, which is what the pay gap does show, and particularly really helped us to think about who sits in our seniority, because actually that's the thing that really drives the gap, is how senior are you, and what are your characteristics. But so I think it has been useful in focusing the attention, but I'm worried it hasn't moved the dial really.
For that example there. Yelisa, did you want to talk about data and reporting?
Yeah, definitely. First I wanted to agree with the views of the panelists, and especially I think what Jane said about how we can use data effectively in government, and the kind of training that is required in respect to that. I have actually seen a case study in South Africa during COVID period, how we managed to use data from our healthcare centers, from our hospitals, and use that data and evidence to inform policy making. And I think that it's something that we must do across the system. And I know that in government, currently in our government, I think we have a real shortage of data analysis skills. When I even look at the structures, because one of the duties of my department is to support departments with the development of their organizational structures. When I look at the organizational structures of the government departments, the issue of data management and data analysis, it's traditionally being done in those big departments like your SAPS and etc., but South African Police and etc. But the other departments that deal with frontline service delivery, that have access to so much data, I don't think we use that data effectively and sufficiently. And I think it's a capability that we need to develop in government, starting with our structures, relooking at our structures, and bringing in the capability to do this work. And I think there's lots of opportunities with young people to train them around this particular area and deploy them in government. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tia, over to you on that.
So much has already been said. I would just add that, yes, we educate on how to use the data, begin to use the data to inform our decisions, begin to establish some, goals, targets, and I don't necessarily mean representation. It could be things like how we are operating that then is going to really change the outcomes, if you will, using the data that we have. And when you then do that, use it to, make it a part of your business plan, make it a part of your business strategy, make it a part of your goals that you are then holding all of your leaders accountable for meeting, exceeding, achieving, because of how it impacts your delivery overall.
That point there as well. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. We'll probably have time just for one more question. So what do you hope for diversity and inclusion in civil and public services in the years and decades to come? And what do you fear if progress isn't made quick enough? So I'm going to come to you all quickly on that. If you could just speak for a minute or so each, then we'll probably have to come to a close after that.
Oh, you're on mute, so we don't know who you want to go first.
Sorry. Yelisa, should we start with you, please?
So I would say, I think my biggest fear is that if we don't deal with the issues of diversity in a sustainable manner, bring young people in large numbers, bring women in decision making, bring people with disabilities as well in large numbers, we're going to have sectors of society that are excluded and that are unhappy, and that could contribute to service delivery challenges. And we will continue to have a small group of people, likely to be men and aged men and women, who are taking decisions around the country and running the country. And I think we need to break this cycle. We need to bring in the younger people. We need to bring in innovation, and younger people are going to assist us to really fast track issues that are related to innovation in the public service, because the older people who are in the public service currently are comfortable with the way of doing things that they are doing, even when it's not efficient and effective. So bringing in younger people is also going to help us to change the culture in the public service. Bringing in people with disabilities is also going to help us to deal with issues of culture in the public service. So that's my biggest fears, but I do think that there is commitment to do this work. We just have to keep on pushing, basically. Thank you.
Yes, and I think maybe there may also be implications for sort of public trust in governments and institutions, which
yes,
sort of waning.
Definitely there will be a drop in trust. And currently in South Africa, we are dealing with the issue of trust in public services by members of communities. So we don't want to add more challenges. We are trying to fix so many issues that relates to the decline in trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Tia.
So I guess I have a hope for continued progress and increased buy-in and belief for the why it's important. You know, so I am hopeful that with the data, with the continued conversations, that folks will begin to understand why it's important to our mission, why it's important to our overall service delivery. You know, it's why it's important to us as public servants. You know, we are here to serve the public. And really making that connection is what I'm hopeful for. What I fear is that if we don't continue to move in this direction, we can potentially lose momentum and we'll miss so many opportunities. I think it's critically important that we are able to not only focus on developing the inclusive organizations, but making certain that, you know, they are, as Jane said, welcoming environments, because this next generation that we want to come in to be public servants is not going to be interested in coming into an organization where they do not feel welcome. So that is also my fear, that we're not going to be able to meet our mission because we're not going to have the workforce that is aligned to what it is we're trying to accomplish, because, you know, our values may not necessarily align with theirs when they really should.
Yeah, Jane.
Thank you. So I'll start with the fear. So a lot of people in the US right now fear we're heading into a recession. And if we do, I am hopeful that one of the things that can come out of it is more people going into government. So, you know, over, you know, the last however many decades of which there is research, what happens in a recession is people start seeing, you know, job loss and fear, and they gravitate toward more predictable careers. And so I am hopeful that, you know, the tech layoffs that have been coming over the last few months and so on, I am hopeful that that will generate more interest in careers in public service. But I think, you know, the point that many of us have raised, which is trust in government, that's something that needs to improve. But I think the way we do that is through storytelling, communication and storytelling. You know, as I mentioned before, we had all this literally like singing in the streets for first responders. But, you know, in government in the US, while there were lockdowns and people were afraid to leave the house, those guys, and I will say guys, because in my neighborhood, they're all guys, the guys who pick up the trash got out there every single day. And the people that fix potholes got out there every single day. And I think in government, what we need is some positive storytelling to communicate the value of public service. And I think we need to get creative. You know, there are lots of different places where we could be recruiting for public servants. You know, one of the arguments I've made in law enforcement is, don't just look at people who are getting a criminal justice degree, look at people who are getting a social sciences or social work, people who have communication skills, people who are interested in engaging on a one-on-one level with people with foreign language skills. We need that in government as we become a more diverse society. So anyway, I could go on and on and on about what I'm hopeful for. And I think that, you know, you've heard the saying, if life gives you lemons, make a lemonade. I have a different way to phrase it, which is, when life gives you lemons, make a minted vodka lemonade. And that's what I hope will happen in the future with public service.
And finally to you, Catherine.
I'm not sure I can top that. I mean, vodka lemonade. Oh, so I'll start with the fear, because it's a bit depressing to end with that. I think my fear is that people in power seem to be using the culture war to drive us further apart. And I think I fear that as the status quo does get challenged in so many ways, that fear will cause sort of social unrest, and that in turn will contribute to sort of people moving further apart rather than together. But the hope that I have a daughter who's 14, and she constantly inspires me in terms of how little regard she gives to, you know, what gender people think they are, you know, what backgrounds people have, and can't really understand, partly probably naivety, but what the big issue is. And so I have a hope that as that generation joins the organization, joins organizations, that will really accelerate the work that we're doing. The thing that I've noticed, even with people joining my teams now, is they're not accepting of the status quo. To Tia's point, they want organizations that reflect their own values. And they're kind of not grateful to be here. They know that they deserve a place at the table. And when I reflect on my own career, I think I spent too much time being grateful. So I'm hopeful that going forward, people will step up to the and know that they have a place at the table and will be part of making our public services positive for all the people that need them.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So yes, that is where I'll bring this webinar to a close. We have unfortunately run out of time. I'm sure you'll all agree that there were some fascinating insights there into what governments can do to improve diversity and inclusion within their organisations. Hopefully you in the audience found it useful. Thank you so much for your questions. There were loads coming in. Unfortunately, we couldn't get around to them all. I'm sure we could fill hours on this topic. But Catherine, I know, for example, that there was quite a bit of interest in the network groups that you mentioned, and that you were answering people's questions via text in the Q&A. So hopefully the people who asked about that have their answers. So thank you very much to you, our panel, to you in the audience for watching. You'll be receiving a recording of the webinar in the next few days, and also a report on the topics covered in the next few weeks. Before that, though, there's a survey that should be in your inbox now to get your thoughts on today's session. And it would really help the team here at Global Government Forum if you could fill that out so that we can make sure that we're providing the best possible content. Any topic ideas you'd like to see us cover in future webinars would also be welcome. We have a whole host of webinars coming up. One of them is, should see it on the screen here. It's taking place on the 23rd of May, and it's called Seeing Through the Hype: What Potential Does the Metaverse Hold for Governments? It will look at the virtual reality space in which people interact with their computer-generated environment and other users, and will explore whether public authorities are right to be considering tapping into the metaverse and what the opportunities are for the delivery of public services. So you can register for that for free if you're interested. And if you'd like to see the list of webinars we have planned over the next few weeks and months, head over to globalgovernmentforum.com to the homepage and click on webinars under the events tab. So once again, Thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.